All right. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is the fourth and final in the series on conservation planning on grazing lands that we're offering this year in 2016. Today, we are going to be talking about the parts of the planning process where we analyze our inventory data, formulate and evaluate alternatives, and just how prescribed grazing fits into all of this. Just to recap from last webinar, the planning process is extremely fluid and dynamic, and while we might represent it as a simple step-by-step process, some parts of the process really have a lot of overlap, and as planners, we move back and forth among the steps, particularly in the earlier phase of the process, as we inventory, analyze, and identify problems, and sometimes even the producer's objectives will begin to evolve as they better understand the issues as they go through this process with us. In the analysis phase, the National Range and Pasture Handbook describes it, after the inventory process is complete, or during it, an analysis of the data is necessary to assist the client to identify and quantify problems. Again, it's imperative for clients to understand the grazing land ecosystem and the concepts before they can appropriately analyze that resource data. It's only then that they can understand the relationship of soil, water, air, plants and animal resources in the ecosystem, how they're related, and the causes that create resource problems. So it's our job as NRCS planners to assist that client to analyze that inventory data, because they don't always have a real thorough understanding and grasp on the grazing land ecosystem. But we're trying to help them learn, and as they do that, it helps them to better understand and identify those resource problems and maybe even see opportunities. So in this part of the process, we might be seeking to answer questions like the ones on the screen. Is the current plant community desirable? Is plant vigor where we want it to be or the client wants it to be? Is the grazing distribution uniform and acceptable? Do we have a balance between forage production and the demands that are being put on the pasture from livestock and wildlife? Is the quality of the forage adequate? Is the current management moving that system towards or away from the desired state? Are there T&E species present? Are there culture resources present? As planners, these are other things that we need to consider. And when we're looking at the condition of the plant community and any problems that are associated with them, we really want to be trying to get at the why. Why is this a problem? What is causing it? You know, and a lot of these questions, I'm sure, for those of you that were able to come out last week or that have been using the condition score sheet or the trend worksheet, are going to recognize these. They're very familiar. They're all incorporated in that grazing land condition score sheet and the trend worksheet. And so today, in order to talk about this process of analysis, I thought it might be helpful if we look at a mock scenario and how this all plays out. So for this mock scenario, let's say we have a client who's come in and is looking for help with trailing issues. He's got a fireweed problem, and he's seeing his herd performance, and he's not happy with it. And he's got a 300-acre ranch. After talking story with him, he determined that he wants to improve his pastures and have less fireweed. He'd like to see his production be more like it was in his grandpa's day when he had the ranch. And he'd really like to do something about the trails because it's gotten so bad that he can't even access the back of his property with a truck. So it makes certain things really challenging from a management standpoint. He looks at a map with you and identifies his property, and he gives you a current herd inventory. Our inventory and analysis tools and processes should be helping us to apply our knowledge and answer the questions on the previous slide. But most importantly, we've got to be applying ourselves to try to look for signs and understand the dynamics that are going on that are causing the resource concerns that we'll see in the field and that the client is coming in with. All right, so before we go out to the field, we start pulling some additional maps and data, and after a site visit, sure enough, we see exactly what he's talking about. with the trailing problem for sure. We walk around out there and we sketch out on a map that pretty much this big long area on the north part of his property is all trailed out, and it's because there's just one water trough way up here in the corner in his corral, fed off of a water meter, and that's the only site that they have to water from. And so they're constantly walking back and forth. You also see there's remnants of an old grazing system. You find, old rusted T-posts standing out here and wooden posts, and it appeared that there used to be gates all along here. And so that's what started all this trailing, and it's continuing to this day. While you're out in the field, you get some good pictures documenting these problems. Definitely that area around that one trough is very heavily impacted. There's certainly appears to be maybe some compaction or some kind of off-site soil movement going on because that trough is really high and all around it is just all bombed. We go and we look at these animal trails, and they're up to 16 inches deep, and they're totally the most severe in the old gate areas, and the deepest ones are closest to that trough. All right. While we're out in the field, we took some time to collect some plant and grazing land trend data and condition data, and we went ahead and did a quick belt transect and along our toe step, and we found that we have around 3,000 fireweed plants per acre. We estimate a 20 to 30% canopy cover of fireweed. We observed that throughout the pasture, we've got kikuyu grass, but the grazing is really uneven. Some kikuyu is really heavily grazed, and some that's growing up in old fireweed plants, they appear to be hardly touched. There's quite a bit of mat out there. We find that we can only find real traces of white clover, and it's probably because it's shaded out with the thick mat or being grazed such that when we go out there we can't even find it. Grazing pressure appears to be highest in the front part of the pasture, nearest the trough, and it appears to get lighter as we go towards the back. And we also notice there seems to be a little bit less fireweed back there. In talking story with the client, we learned that he lives over 50 miles away. He has a day job, and so most of his ranch work has to occur on the weekend. He's a young guy though, he's very open-minded, and he knows that he can do this better, and he's really grateful for your help. In talking to, you recognize with him that if we were to get on some kind of a grazing rotation, the shortest he could do is 1 week because he's off on the weekends and they often come out to the ranch to hang out or to do work. All right, so as we start looking at our data and considering what we see in the field, we can pretty much conclude that the main plant-related issues are the increasing invasive species, the fireweed, the patchy, uneven grazing. We got a real thick kikuyu grass mat built up across most of the pasture, except where it's being really heavily grazed, and that's affecting, both things are affecting plant vigor. Overall, though, we noticed, it didn't quite look overstocked. We certainly weren't walking around on a golf course. There was a lot of untouched grass, but it was also obvious that there are plants that are being overgrazed. So we take that info back in the office and we start wondering about, I wonder, maybe how does his stocking rate, his current stocking rate, compare with what that site's potential could be. And because, like I said, while we're out there, the plant community is definitely not where it could be, and we see that there's a lot of grass, so we're suspecting that maybe he's lightly stocked. We're mulling it all over, and we start to look again at the soil data, and we start to notice, this maybe isn't that reliable either, because there's this huge difference between the 487 soil type, that's the yellow, and the 955. They're estimating a range from 2,000 to 14,000 pounds per acre. We didn't see evidence of a huge, you guys have to take my word for it, but there's no evidence in the field of this huge difference in production out there. So we're not real confident in using this number to calculate our forage animal balance. So what do we do with this? So we go back out to the field. We take all of our clipping gear, we get out there, we ready to clip. We start walking around, still not easily done. how do we measure production on a site like this? There's nothing that's rested. There's no way to estimate total annual production because everything's exposed to livestock all the time. There's tons of fireweed out there, even in the hoop. And the hillsides are different. They're mostly all rat tail. And it's different from the front of the pasture to the back. So how do we clip a site like this and try to represent, try to get an idea of something that might be representative of the whole pasture? Yes, you still clip. Because we remember, and we talk about how there's a difference from the front to the back. And so we come up with a plan to clip from different places across the ranch so that we can compare that data. We select sites in the field that represent the variability out there. We recognize that it's all grazed, so nothing is rested. The data that we're going to get is not going to be total annual production, but it'll be useful nonetheless. So we clip in the front, we get 1,600 pounds per acre, and since we had fireweed in our plot just for kicks, we went ahead and measured that separately. We got 800 pounds of fireweed in that one clip plot. In the second clip plot, we had more kikuyu grass. It was in a pretty decent spot, a little bit of fireweed in there, and we actually had a little bit of clover. And we went and we clipped another plot on the hillside. We see we had very little kikuyu grass, only 200 pounds. We didn't have any fireweed in that plot, but we had a lot of rat tail. And then in the farthest plot that we clipped, we got about 4,000 pounds per acre of kikuyu grass. A little bit of fireweed, it's still out there, but there's not that much. And so this gives us a range of what we have out there. Now we can compare this data with the soils information and maybe some book values and determine a decent estimate that we can use in order to try to calculate a baseline forage animal balance. So here we compare all the different sources of our data. What the soil tables tell us versus what we clipped, which again didn't represent annual production, so we didn't expect to find that, but it gives us an idea of what's out there now. And then we also compare that with some book values for kikuyu grass in Hawaii. We read in the Grazing Land Stewardship Manual that in Hawaii, pastoral settings, kikuyu grass production can be in the range from 3 to 4 tons per acre. Okay, that's a number we can use, between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds. So based on all of this, we look at it all, we think about what we saw in the field, and we feel pretty safe in using an assumption of about 7,000 pounds per acre for our baseline. It's reasonable to expect that from the clipping data. It's right in the middle of the range of the soils, and it's also right in the middle of the range of the Grazing Land Stewardship Manual. It's probably a decent place to start. And if you're really not confident in making a call like that, that's what I'm here for, or other people that are in the field offices that have a lot more experience on grazing lands. You could bounce some of these numbers, show some pictures from the field if you need to, and get someone to consider this and concur. So now that we have that number, we can take that data and our other information, and we can use that to evaluate the benchmark forage animal balance. You should be starting to see, as we go through this process, why a thorough inventory is so important. Without all this information, grazable acres, number of animals in the operation, the pastures they graze on, what kind of condition they're in, approximately what the production is per acre, if we don't have that information, we certainly can't analyze it. And we need to be able to analyze that information in order to know what our options might look like going forward and what we might be able to get to. And most importantly, what's causing the problems. So as we start to move forward towards the forage animal balance, the 528 PI grazing planning tool is very helpful. It is been renamed and it's in the EFOTG in the Prescribed Grazing folder. I find that it's most helpful for this exact thing of the forage animal balance. Okay, we're going to go to the 528 grazing tool, and then we're going to stop and answer any questions. Okay, so I've opened the PI grazing tool. I hope you can see it. And I'm going to go to the second tab, which is going to help me to develop a forage curve. I'm going to try and make this a little bit bigger and hopefully get it to where you guys can see it good. Is that pretty good? I'm going to go ahead and click the Waimea button, and I'm going to go ahead and use this template data that's in here. I'm going to say that's fair enough. And I'm going to answer these questions here. Is water limiting forage growth factor? I'm going to say yes. And is forage growth suppressed by temperatures? Up here, yes. And if yes, estimate the percent suppression. I've played around with this a lot, and I feel pretty comfortable with a 15% suppression for me. This is a total arguable number. We could spend a lot of time talking about it. I wish I could find some reliable research data. I think James Leary has some that I'd like to dig into and see if I can give you guys some better guidance on what to put in there. But for this example, that's what we're going to use. And now that I've developed the forage growth curve based on the rainfall, basically, rainfall and a slight adjustment for temperature, we're going to go over to the inventory and analysis. Don't stress on this too much, but you do have to populate this screen in order for the next tab to work, okay? You do have to populate it. And I highly recommend, if your site is not typical of one of these that are already in here, going to the the UH Rainfall Atlas and finding your site and getting better site-specific data, particularly if it's very different. Okay, so on the second tab, the Inventory Analysis tab, we're going to start entering some information. In the system ID, because I'm calculating the benchmark forage animal balance, I'm going to call it benchmark. And put in today's date. All right, so the client told us that he had a herd of cows and calves, a bull, and a horse. So I start by checking those off, and I'm going to start entering the information relative to those animals. For the cow-calf herd, I'm going to click on the herd management info, and that'll bring up this little window. It's going to ask me, when is the calving month? Because he breeds year-round, they're dropping calves all the time, but because our spring season does come in about March or April, it's pretty decent to assume that the majority of his calves could drop in that time. It really doesn't matter. If he knows when most of his calves hit the ground, that would be very helpful. From the inventory he gave us, it appeared that only about 1/3 of his animals had calves at their side, so we're going to assume that maybe it is more in March. And this herd stays on this grazing system all year round. So we're going to say okay. When it comes to the bulls, he also breeds year round, so we're just going to double check to make sure that his option also is selected for stays on the grazing system year round. And we're going to say okay. And the same with the horse right now. The horse just is out there with the cows and the bull. It doesn't leave unless the cousin comes to pick him up. So we're going to leave him in there all year round as well. We know from the information the client gave us, he's got about 52 cows. 18 of those have calves. We're going to assume an average weight of 1,000 pounds. Oops. And we're going to give them a standard 2.6 intake rate. Okay, that's a book recommendation. For the bulls, he said he has one, say he weighs about 1,400 pounds, and he's just got a maintenance intake rate of 2%. And for the horse, I'm just going to estimate that he just has one, and he weighs 1,300 pounds. And been told that horses in maintenance, that they will eat more, so we're going to give them a 3%, okay, just to be conservative. All right, so now that we've entered our livestock information for our forage animal balance, we can scroll down to the next part of the worksheet, and we can enter our grazing system pasture forage production information. That's a mouthful. He just has one paddock right now, and we have to choose the type of forage. When you look at the list of options you have here, every type of forage has an upper and a lower. That correlates with this first tab on whether you identify these as upper paddocks or lower paddocks. This is set up such that if you have a ranch operation that's so large, it goes across zones to where you might have differences in forage growth between upper and lower. So the main thing to know is whichever one of these you populate, make sure that's the forage type that you select. Okay, so we're going to go down and find kikuyu grass, upper, and that's our selection. Our usable acres, he has about 330 acres, our map told us. And we said that we were going to use an estimated forage production of 7,000 pounds per acre. And once we enter all that, we can click on Calculate Pasture Grazing Efficiency. And it's figuring that with a single pasture, the grazing efficiency is only 25%. So now we've given the model the information on the animals. We've given the model the information on the forage. So we can scroll down and we can look at the balance and whether we are in a surplus, a deficit, or if we're balanced. And so in this little box, summary of feed and forage balance, it tells us that we have a surplus of 59,604 pounds. And our graph, which I really like looking at the best, shows that we do have a surplus of accumulated forage at the end of the year that is just under 70,000 pounds. That's interesting. So the green line on this graph represents our forage growth curve, and that's related to that rainfall curve. You'll see it looks very similar. The red line on here represents our forage demand curve based on our herd and what's going on with them, and we said that they calve in March, so that's why you see this increase. And then the blue line is the difference between the red and the green. Oh, I know why this is high, because over here we're actually eating more. So this is taking a total difference for the whole year, and this is the difference in December. Okay, so with that, we've done our benchmark forage animal balance. The model agrees with what we thought we saw out in the pasture. The pasture is slightly understocked or lightly stocked, and so let's go back to our PowerPoint. And I will take any questions at this point if anyone has any.
I got one, Carolyn. This is Jason Kalui.
Sure,
the 7,000 pounds of forage, that was just what is currently available in the pasture, correct? Not the actual total forage production?
No, that is our estimated total forage production. And we came to that conclusion based on, we clipped in the field, wherever we dropped our hoop, we had from 200 pounds of kikuyu up to 4,000 pounds that day. So that's what was there. It was a big range, right, because the whole place is all unevenly grazed.
Yeah.
But the book values and the soils values gave us ranges that were also, we had a range from 2,000 to 14,000 based on the soils. But we knew from looking out there, we weren't really at either of those. We weren't that low and we weren't that high. And then the book value for kikuyu grass gave us a range of 6,000 to 8,000 pounds. And so I just kind of using professional judgment said, probably a value of about 7,000 is probably a pretty safe assumption for now. And then we can always work on refining that later.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Hi, Carolyn, this is Renee.
Yes.
So on that previous slide, if you go back, please, or forward or wherever you were at, in regards to map units and the pounds per acre. Okay, so on the map symbol and soil name, where is there information like that for the island of Maui, or is this from the ecological site description?
This is from the current the current soil survey for the Big Island, and I don't believe it's in the Maui one, but I'd have to double check.
Okay.
I'm trying to work on a strategy for helping the other islands estimate their forage production, kind of based on similarities to what I know ranges are here.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
But the Grazing Land Stewardship Manual has estimates by species, so there's at least something to go off of in there. All right. So with that, coming back to our results of our benchmark forage animal balance analysis, we concluded that the pasture is not overstocked, but we recognize that we do have forage plants that are being overgrazed based on the evidence we saw in the field. This overgrazing is being caused by the fact that our grazing intensity on individual plants is totally not controlled. Duration of grazing is too long. They're out there 365 days a year, and frequency is too much. They're out there constantly. Our client is seeing the effects of this overgrazing in the recognized problems that he came in the door with, of the bad animal trailing and lots of fireweed. And the grazing management may also have something, may be contributing to his poor herd performance. That's a little bit harder to determine. But the main thing we need to do at this point is help him make those connections and understand that the trailing is due to the fact that there's no water distribution and those animals are out there all year round. That the fireweed that is increasing is due to the spot overgrazing and having no recovery. And, we could talk to him about some of the different things that could be contributing to what he's seeing as poor animal performance. It could be related to inconsistent forage quality. It could be related to distance between water and forage. It could certainly have a lot of other things to do with his what could be going on in his herd from a herd health perspective, and the possibility that he could have cows that are no longer reproductively reliable anymore. And perhaps his bull, he's just got one bull out there, perhaps his bull isn't as vigorous as he could be. At this stage, it's also important that we leave our paper trail and document the benchmark conditions. An easy way to do that would be by printing your benchmark forage animal balance pages from that 528 planning tool and putting in the file as part of your inventory. I put it right behind your grazing land condition score sheet and trend worksheet. Keep in mind, if you only print the graph, you're very limited in information. You don't know what animals you use to generate this. You don't know what acres or forage production that you use to generate this. So you probably want to print a little bit more. Let's just go back real quick to this, and you see this field up here for notes. I like to put information in here about what I used. I might say that the clipping data ranged from 200 to 4,000 pounds per acre, assumed 7,000 pounds per acre from the Grazing Land Stewardship Manual. Might make some other notes in here that the cattle bred year-round. Currently, 1/3 of the herd had calves on the ground, and just unclear what the annual calf crop looked like. Is put something in there, because if you go down and you start printing screens from here, if you print the livestock inventory and demand sheet, it'll put that information on that form. So at least you've got it now in the file. Someone else can pick up your stuff and figure out, or, at least have something to go by of how you got your numbers, what was going on. It can just be helpful, yeah. And then you can also see how many cows you use, that they're on the system year-round, what intake rate you use, what weight you use, etc. Same goes for printing the forage production summary. If you print that, it'll tell you, it'll generate for your printout that just has exactly this information: how many acres and what forage production rate you used, what was the pasture grazing efficiency. And then print out the graph, and printing out the feed and forage balance summary is also not a bad idea. It gives you the surplus or deficit. And because you put benchmark up here in your system ID, that should stamp that on all those forms, okay? All right. All right, so with all the information we've gathered, we document all these things in our CPTN1. Now that we have our problems identified and documented, we have a pretty good idea of what's going on, what's causing the problems. We can start looking at what we might start to do to address these problems, what the client might consider doing to address these problems. This is a step that we call formulating alternatives. We have the client's objectives and the problems that we've identified together, so we start putting together options for the client to consider to start addressing them. He can choose which problems he's ready and willing and able to address and how he'd like to address them. Our job is to present him with the options and help him weigh those options. So we had problems related with the soil, the trailing within the soils and the compaction that was happening in there, how it was limiting access. We had lots of problems with the plant community as far as the productivity and health, the excessive plant pest pressure, the structure and composition is really not where the client would like it to be for grazing, and he's got a very inadequate livestock water system. So his options would be he could start picking which of these he'd like to address. Maybe he just wants to focus on the water at first. Or maybe he wants to take on the water and start doing something to make his grazing situation a little better, improve his plant community. Or alternative 3, he may want to do both of those and do something about that trailing and stabilize those areas. And we could use a practice like critical area planting or forage and biomass planting. We could kind of do either. I just encourage you to really read the standard and try to do the one that makes the most sense. Critical area planting is specific to revegetating areas that are very difficult to revegetate naturally. Because those places are so badly damaged, they're not revegetating naturally. You could use that practice. I think you'd want to look at the standard and look at the payment scenarios for which one would fit the best based on what the prescription would require. Okay. So then we help him evaluate these options and understand what each one could address and start estimating the economics of each option. Once he's considered all the options, he might decide that he likes alternative 3 the best. But he's not real big on the idea of spraying 300 acres of fireweed. Plus, he doesn't have the equipment or the time to spray it. So he decides he likes alternative 3, but he just doesn't want to do the herbaceous weed control. As a planner, we recall that we read somewhere that fireweed can be managed through improved grazing management. It can be quite successful. So we say, okay, this is something we can work with. So with that, we can move forward in the planning process. Now we can start focusing on the site-specific details of the practices, such as how many paddocks are we going to put out there? What size should those paddocks be? What type of fence should we put out there? Can we put out there? What kind does he want? What kind can we do? What type of trough and where will we locate those? Before, in considering these questions, we need to, again, consider information from our inventory. We might have inventoried and found that we do have T&E species concerns out there that we'd have to address. So that might affect the type of fence that we're going to put in. We might know that we might need to know whether or not the water system has any limitations. Is there enough pressure to get water all the way to the back, or are we going to be limited in how far the water can go? Is the hills back there and the soil types that are back there, are they going to limit the ability to put in fence lines that we have to work around? What about the client's experience and availability? And what kind of management does his herd need, or is he planning to change anything? And as we start developing these things, we have to make sure we're going to have a rotation that's going to work, and that the client is accepting the fact that if he's going to work with us, particularly in a Farm Bill program, our conservation practice standards and specifications are going to have to be things that he's got to abide by. Before we can really get to answering any of these questions, we're going to have an idea of what the system is going to look like, that grazing system. And again, we've got to consider our inventory information. The practice that deals with the system and questions like how many paddocks and what size and stuff like that is the 528 prescribed grazing practice. So those questions lead us right to there, and we should be looking at the standard and the specification. Let's start by reviewing the definition of prescribed grazing and its purposes. The definition reads, managing the harvest of vegetation with grazing and or browsing animals. Managing the harvest of vegetation with grazing. Basically, grazing management. The purposes. Practice can be applied as a part of a conservation management system to achieve one or more of the following. Improve or maintain desired species composition and vigor of plant communities. Ding, ding, ding. That's one of the main things we're trying to do in this. That's one of his main goals and objectives. Improve or maintain quantity and quality of forage for grazing and browsing animals' health and productivity. Ding, ding, ding. That's another one. That's what he would like to do. He'd like to see his animals' health and productivity improve. And it's a forage-based system. That purpose, again, fits in with how we're using this practice in this situation. Some of the other purposes that can be applicable are improving surface or subsurface water quality, improving riparian and watershed function, reducing soil erosion or improving soil condition, improving or maintaining the quantity and quality of food or cover for wildlife, and managing fine fuel loads to achieve desired conditions. So you don't have to meet all the purposes, but for sure, your situation should fit one or two of these purposes if you're going to apply them. The general criteria for 528 includes these things. Removal of herbage, so removal of plant matter, will be in accordance with site production limitations, rate of plant growth, the physiological needs of forage plants, and the nutritional needs of animals. Okay, so removal of vegetation in accordance with site production limitations, rate of plant growth. This kind of sounds like we're talking about balancing the forage production and what's being taken out in the forage demand, right? Forage animal balance. Adjusting intensity, frequency, timing, and duration of grazing to meet the desired objectives for the plant community, including the grazing or browsing animal. Okay, intensity, frequency, timing, duration, that's all stuff we talked about earlier in grazing management, right? We talked about how each of those are tools that we can use in affecting the plant community. So we want to make sure that whatever system we're going to do is going to meet this criteria of having intensity, frequency, timing, duration, in order that we are meeting the objectives of the plant community and the grazing animal. Once again, we're balancing. We want to manage the kind of animal, animal number, grazing distribution, length of grazing period, and timing of use to provide grazed plants sufficient recovery time to meet planned objectives. Okay, recovery time. That's an important element for 528. We've got to have a system that provides adequate recovery time for our forage plants, and in doing that, we often have to look at managing the kind of animal, the length of the grazing period, okay, grazing distribution, all of those things. And lastly, manage livestock movements based on the rate of plant growth, available forage, and allowable utilization targets. Allowable utilization targets, that's talking about stubble heights, that's talking about utilization rate, that whole take half, leave half concept. So we want to be working on a system that's going to manage that grazing activity and grazing rotation such that we're making sure that we aren't exceeding those utilization targets. You see how all of these criteria and everything about 528 relates to both the grazing animals and the plant's resource base. Our management of either affects the other. And with the prescribed grazing practice, we're trying to manage the animal's needs with the plant's needs through the grazing management. That's all within the producer's ability and availability, all of which should be moving toward toward achieving the objectives for the plant community and the grazing animals. No problem, right? Piece of cake. It sounds overwhelming, that's because it can be, but it's not if we just kind of keep it simple and take it one step at a time. So let's take a quick look at the spec. The purpose of the spec is to provide additional guidance for developing a grazing plan. Okay, great. Some of the things included in the spec is useful information on stuff like utilization rates and guidelines for stubble heights and recovery periods. A lot of good information in the spec. The job specifications will be recorded on the practice job sheet. Both the standard and the spec list the required elements of the 528 grazing plan. Okay, so those include all these things I've highlighted: goals and objectives, the resource inventory, which you've got on your CPTN1 and your grazing land condition score sheet and trend worksheet, your forage inventory and the expected forage quality, and your forage animal balance. We just talked about how we can generate that out of the grazing tool. Your grazing plan has to be described and developed and described. Contingency plan and a monitoring plan, all these elements are what goes into a complete prescribed grazing plan or job sheet. Our job sheet conveniently prompts the planner to document most of those elements in this format. And we're going to go through this in a little more detail further on in this webinar as we keep working through this example. So okay, all of that is well and good, but we didn't answer these questions yet, right? How many paddocks and what size paddocks and all that stuff. Well, the answers are going to depend on the client's objectives, the 528 requirements, and our inventory information. We've got to look at all those things and try to come up with the answers. And some of the things we need to consider are what is or will be the key forage species for this system. What does it need? because that's gonna affect our grazing period, our recovery period, and how many paddocks we're gonna need. What is the desired and doable grazing period for the client? How many herds does he want to have? Does he know what type of system he wants? And always keeping in mind what's causing the problems we're trying to solve, and will the planned system that we're going to work on with this client actually address those causes? We can't ever lose sight of those two questions. So we get a lot of answers from our inventory and analysis, the 528 spec, and the client. So for this example, we want to answer the question of what's causing the problems. We know from our inventory that this consistent selective grazing and no recovery period in this set stock grazing scenario is contributing to the problems that we see in our plant community. What is or will be the key forage species? That one's easy, kikuyu grass. What does our key forage species need? We can go to our 528 spec and we can read that the kikuyu grass recommended recovery period is from 18 to 40 days, and that range depends on your growing conditions. A minimum stubble height for kikuyu grass is 4 inches. Okay, that'll be good to know. We'll probably need to put that in the grazing plan. From the client, we know that his desired and doable grazing period for him, he told us, was the very shortest he could do is 1 week because he works during the week. And how many herds? Well, he's just got 1 herd now, and he kind of thinks it might be helpful for him to go to a seasonal breeding. So he tells you, okay, I want to keep the cow-calf herd, and I'd like to be able to manage my bulls and possibly a horse or two occasionally. If my cousin's going to come over and bring his horses out, I'd like to be able to put them somewhere and manage them. And what type of system does he want? Well, he's been hearing about and talking about and learning about rotational grazing, and he thinks that that's probably where he'd like to start. So, all right. With that information, now we can go and we can start trying to answer these questions. For the cow-calf herd, we've got to consider these for each herd, right? For the cow-calf herd, we've already recognized that key forage species is kikuyu. We know the target recovery periods from the spec, and we know what his targeted grazing period would be. And 7 days, we figure, is probably what we'd like to work with, because there's a reduced chance for a second bite or that type of overgrazing versus a 14-day grazing period, okay? Because he can move weekly, that kind of would be our options, right? A 1 week, a 2 week, a 3 week grazing period. And during the growing season, that could be detrimental. So we're gonna say we're gonna plan for a 7-day grazing period. To calculate the number of paddocks, the basic equation is you take your recovery period, your target recovery period, you divide it by the grazing period, and you add 1. So the cattle need to be in 1 pasture, so that's what that 1 is, the paddock that they're in. So we take our long recovery period, we go 40 days divided by 7, we get 5.7. We round up to 6 plus 1, that gives us a 7 paddock minimum that we would need in a rotation in order to achieve the longer recovery period. We do the same equation for the short recovery period, we get 18 days divided by 7-day grazing period. That gives us 2.5. We round up to 3 plus 1. With a 4 paddock system, we'd be able to achieve the short recovery period, right? Because it'd be 3 weeks before they'd come back on the same pasture. So they would get a 21-day recovery period if we had 4 paddocks, and if we had the 7, it'd be 6 times 7 is 42. So it'd be 42 days. So that's what we kind of have to work within. He can choose what he would like, what type of system he would like, and with grazing management, we have some flexibility, but it depends on where the client wants to be flexible. Because if he goes with a less intensive system, he may have to be stocked a little bit lighter, okay? Versus a more intense system, he has higher efficiency of grazing, he can probably have a little bit of a higher stocking rate. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So the paddocks, as much as possible, as we start sketching them out, we want to try and see if we can figure out a arrangement whereby we can provide approximately an equal number of grazable acres with similar forage production, if possible. And then, as he starts implementing the system, whether or not the paddock will be able to be grazed for 7 days, and he needs to understand this, is going to depend on the pasture's condition, okay, what kind of productive capacity it has, the size that it ends up being, based on where the fence actually gets put in, the growing conditions at the time, right? We can set up a beautiful system, but if we get hit with a really bad drought, we may not have a lot of good growth and production, and so there may not, depending on how big his herd is, he may not be able to keep him in there for 7 days without overutilizing it. And then, yes, his herd size. However many animals he's got in that herd is going to have an effect on how long they can stay in those paddocks once they're built. Because once those fences are up, you're generally not moving them. Okay, for the other group of animals he identified, the bulls and the horses. The client, in our discussions, he says he wants those to be close to the road and the corral. When we were out in the field, we noticed a lot of old dilapidated fencing, and one of them was towards the front. And he mentioned during the inventory that this is one that he would really consider removing all this old stuff and rebuilding it. The area in the front of that fence is about 27 acres. The system for this bull and horse group of animals is much more of a put and take. The bulls aren't going to be in there year-round because they're going to be breeding the herd part of the year. And, you know, the client doesn't actually own horses, but his cousins do. And so every now and then they want to bring their horses out and be able to ride around, especially maybe right before branding or weaning. He also said that, you know, when it is time for branding and weaning, sometimes it's nice to be able to have a holding pen. So these pastures might be used for double duty, and he might use them to bring the herd in and use them when he's sorting his animals and whatnot. So since this area is most likely going to be pretty lightly stocked with 27 acres and, you know, probably just a handful of animals, and then, you know, surely used intermittently, it does not require as intensive a management, but it does still need the ability to recover if it's going to get better. A 2-paddock minimum is what would probably be recommended so that he can get some kind of control and rest while the animals are there. If he would like to go a little bit more, that would be an option. But, you know, we shouldn't be getting crazy with an 8-paddock rotation for a couple of bulls. It's probably overkill. But, you know, just talking story with him and determining, you know, what he feels like is going to be okay would probably be a good start. And recognizing that we don't encourage set stock grazing, even with just a few animals. And then whether you're going to plan that area for prescribed grazing depends on where you finally end up in the end. And so now that you have an idea of what you have to work with and what you're aiming for, we can work with the client then to help them understand the targets and why, you know, why we have this 4 to 7 paddocks that we might shoot for, what's the relevancy of the recovery period and whatnot, and then figure out what he feels and thinks about it and what's possible and what can work for his operation. Now you get to apply your skills in ArcGIS or just on the pencil and paper and start talking conceptually about options and you know, what different setups could look like. And then the client can decide what direction he wants to take, and then from there you can refine the details. The main thing is whatever we put out there as options, there has to be a rotation that can work. We've got to be able to get from the last paddock back up to the first paddock. You know, the purple situation is kind of sort of what Grandpa had. He had this long alleyway that connected all the pastures, so he could get from any of them to the corral. He could get from the front to the back, no problem. But it also created that really bad trailing problem. So, you know, we recognize it's an option, but it might come at a cost, and the client may or may not be willing to bear that cost. The blue option, you know, we can start with a basic system that's designed to be built on later. You can always expand or add on to a system like that. It's a 4-paddock rotation. We'd be able to get the minimum recovery period, and it might be where the client's comfortable starting. So there's all different things to consider. Ultimately, again, we're providing options. It's up to the client to think about and consider, you know, his animal husbandry needs and concerns, his availability, his ability to manage, and what he would like to do. And then, you know, we can always start with a basic system, and you can easily see how you can go from the blue system to the red by just adding a few more cross fences, and you can move on. Okay, but let's say that for this system, the client chooses the blue, and pretend there's also a blue line up here. I forgot that he also agreed that a 2-paddock rotation in the front would be fine to start with. Now, with this information, we can estimate a new forage animal balance. And since the system was super understocked before, we can see where it would balance out with the new grazing efficiency, so we can give the client an idea on kind of what the carrying capacity might be and where he might be able to get to of course, it all depends on whether our assumed 7,000 pounds per acre is accurate or not. We may have underestimated. It's also possible we overestimated. I kind of doubt it, but it's possible. So we want to keep that in mind and just kind of let him know that the model isn't perfect, but it's a pretty fair estimate, and then we can reassess it as we go, and particularly as we get the opportunity to maybe do more clipping and really try to dial in that production estimate. Okay? So I'm going to go back to the 528 planning tool, and we're going to plug in this new system. But before I do, are there any questions at this point? Okay, hearing none. I'm going to go back here. If you have a question, just stop me. All right. So now we're going to adjust our numbers, and we're going to change it up, particularly with how the pastures are cut up. Can you guys see this okay?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to maybe try and get this a little bit bigger. Maybe that helps you see what I'm changing a little more. So we said we're going to cut up those pastures into 4. So what we want to do is we want to add more paddocks here. Okay, we want to assign the same, forage. Copy. Okay, we got to change up these acreages. So that last sketch that I had up had our acres at, let's see, 70.3, 73.6, 73.2, and 70.8. And we're going to give them all a 7,000 pounds per acre production, and we're going to recalculate pasture efficiency. Okay, so it already did it for us. Our pasture efficiency is now 35%, so we gained 10% in efficiency because we cut it up into 4 paddocks. Great. What did that do? We're going to leave our herd, our benchmark herd, the same, and we're going to go down and see what did that do to our feed and forage balance. So we now have a difference of 187,000 pounds of forage. That's quite a difference. The first time it was a surplus of, did I print that? I didn't. The surplus was just under 60,000 pounds. And you can see our graph looks really different too, yeah? We're accumulating all this feed because we're understocked now, that we're more efficiently using the pastures in the way that we've got them cut up. So we're going to go up and we can adjust the herd numbers and start playing with this in order to try and see if we can get it to balance. So let's say we take the herd up to 65 animals, and let's say we go with 2 bulls. That might be a little low, but where are we at now? Okay, getting a little closer. We have a difference of 53,000 pounds. We're definitely still very much in the positive in our accumulated forage. Don't worry too much about this part looking so bleak, because as you can see, we actually end the year with a surplus, so we'd actually have something in the bank in January. This model assumes that we start with 0. Okay, so don't stress about that too much. The main thing to look at is your overall difference and kind of where you're ending up. So let's try and adjust those numbers one more time. Let's try and take it up to 73 cows, 3 bulls, and 1 horse. Okay. Ooh, that didn't work so good. Now we've got a deficit of 32,000 pounds. Okay, so let's go back up. We can adjust this again. Okay, we're getting closer. Now we just have a difference of 3,000. All right, so we can keep playing with that number until we get it to balance. I think if we just go down by 1 more animal unit, we will have fixed it. I don't know why, but when I balanced this earlier, it balanced at 73. So, but here we've got it balanced at 69. I have probably entered a number wrong somewhere, but now we have an idea on where he might be able to go to, yeah, in the future. he's got 52 animals now, he may be able to, you know, add almost 20 more animals in his cow herd if he adopts this system. Once again, it would be a good idea to, if this is the system he's going to go with, this is what we're going to do, you can use this forage animal balance for your 528 grazing plan job sheet. But I would recommend that you adjust your numbers up here. Again, keep your assumption data up here, keep it up there and add to it. Oh, I know what happened. We also changed the breeding, right? Client said that he was going to breed seasonally now. So we pull up the bull management info and we say that there's going to be a single breeding season and it's going to be moved to the grazing system for breeding only one time per year, and otherwise it's going to stay on an alternate pasture. That's pretty much exactly what we're going to do. So when we click on that button, it brings up another window and it asks, okay, well, what month are you going to, is the bull going to be on the grazing system breeding the cows? And so we're going to say that the bull is going to go in there from May to, say he has a 90-day breeding season. It's going to go in from May to August. August is 8. I'm going to close that window, select this again. Okay. Now we've got alternative pasture forage amounts being generated down here, or demand. And the horses also are in that alternative pasture, and they're in there all year round. So we're going to move them out of the grazing system, and we're going to put them on the alternative pasture from January to, let's just say, December. Let's just speculate that the horses are going to end up living there. I'll keep them there for now. It'll be more conservative, if anything, but we'll make sure that we can balance that system as well. Okay, so now let's go down and see what we got going on. All right. So our balance on the grazing system changed because we removed the bulls and the horses. And our alternative system is not balancing. I think I know why. Hang on one sec, guys. Oh, I know why. We forgot to enter our pasture information for alternative pasture. Here we go. So we said we were going to have 2 paddocks. Sorry, and they're both Kikuyu. Okay. And the acres, we had 27 acres up in the front there, so let's say they're each 13 acres. And we still got 7,000 pounds. And our grazing efficiency is not calculating for us, but we know when we had a single pasture rotation, we had 25%, so let's just be conservative there. Okay, so now we've got forage being generated, estimated for those acres with that production. Now our graph is working. Good. Okay, so now we can look at both of these and make sure we're in the black, so to speak, and we are. Everything's above 0, so that's good. Looks like we would be okay with 3 bulls and 1 horse in that front area. And what did we have up here? 69 cows. Let's see now if we can go to 73. What does that do? All right, so even if I increase that herd size now to 73 cows, we're still in the black. And this is where I balanced it earlier, so this is what I thought I should come up with. Okay, so we've got it balanced for both herds in this example, and now we could take that information and print it out for our grazing plan. Any questions? I know that 528 planning tool can be kind of quirky, and sometimes it was overwhelming to me when I first started playing with it, but the more I play with it and the more I use it, the more I like it. But there's definitely room for it to improve, but it's a good start. Okay, so we have our planned forage animal balance now. With a 4-paddock rotation, we have a planned system that's balanced for the cow herd at 73 cows, and for the bulls and the horses, it's balanced with 3 bulls and 1 horse. This forage animal balance, like I said, can be incorporated into the 528 job sheet. The 528 job sheet has this section for forage inventory and forage animal balance. You could put in, the information that you got, going through your benchmark and going through your plan system. You could identify in here with your forage inventory what your key forage species are, what the estimated production that you use, where you got your numbers, and then reference the 528 planning tool printouts that you could then attach to this document for the forage animal balance. And so these are all the forms that I would recommend you print, because it's really the information that you would need in order to fully understand the forage animal balance. If you only printed the graph, like I said, you would be missing a lot of information. But if you print each of these sheets, then you would be able to put those all together and it would be comprehensive. Okay? So going on to the next part of the grazing job sheet, the grazing plan. So from the spec, the grazing plan is supposed to describe a system that provides sufficient rest for the forage type throughout the year, that the grazing plan should allow for vigorous regrowth, following grazing, never more than 50% use, so it's incorporating utilization rate. Also, if you're managing a system with seed-bearing grasses, that you'd also be planning for occasional seed set to make sure that forage species persists in your pasture. This part of the job sheet is probably the hardest part to write. In the job sheet itself, it refers to describing a schedule of when paddocks will be grazed, the approximate dates. I've never found that I've ever been able to do that in the tropics. It's pretty much probably not even a good idea to tell a client, okay, yeah, on December 16th, you're going to go into paddock 5 and you haven't been out there for months. You don't want to give the client a calendar by which he's going to manage his grazing. It'd be better if he learned what things to be looking at and understanding what's going on in his pasture and making his grazing decisions based on that, and then being able to call you, of course, if he needs help. So in the grazing plan, it's a good idea to focus on describing the grazing rotation, describing the planned grazing period and recovery periods, what the targets are for proper grazing use so that the client knows, all this information, that he agrees, yes, we talked about a weekly grazing period. We're going to try and achieve a minimum of 21-day recovery period, and our targeted grazing use is 4-inch stubble height. And then if there's concern about grazing uniformity, you could also include strategies for encouraging that, such as, moving the supplement of the salt or minerals or something away from the water and encouraging the animals to get all the way out there. So I put in a very short example summary of kind of how a description could look. It could be very, very basic. A single cow-calf herd will graze through a 4-paddock rotation. All right, you're describing it for someone. Our target grazing period is 7 days. The recovery period is 21 days. The target stubble height is 4 inches. You've written it all down that now the client is agreeing to it. And then you're also bringing into discussion if the growing conditions are such that the production is low, the grazing period or herd size may need to be adjusted to avoid overutilizing the pastures, right? It's all this stuff that we've been talking about that the client has within his control that he can use in order to ensure that he's making sure that he's managing for his pasture's health and well-being, which in the long run benefits his animals' performance as well. The next part of the 528 job sheet is the contingency plan. Contingency plan is designed to, or is there for writing down a plan for dealing with potential problems. The types of problems to be addressed is going to depend on the operation, where it's located, and what kind of risks are inherent to it. Not every place has risk of wildfire or flooding, but some places do. Pretty much all of the Pacific Islands area are susceptible to drought, so all 528 plans should address drought. And the contingency plan should describe what will be monitored and when the plan will be implemented, particularly for drought management plan. So talking about, we're going to monitor maybe precipitation and setting a threshold whereby the drought management strategies will be implemented. Because, when we go into a drought, everybody's in denial for a long time, right? Oh, no, it's going to rain, it's going to rain, it's going to rain, it's going to rain. But if we don't develop something that says, well, if we, for example, I know one rancher, he uses a formula that looks something like, if he's got less than 50% of the average rainfall that he knows his ranch receives, because he's monitored rainfall for the last 40 years, if he's got less than 50% for 3 consecutive months, he's already going to begin implementing parts of his drought management plan. Okay, that's a good strategy. You got to talk it out with your client and come to something that's agreeable. A 3-month period would be great. Maybe they would feel more comfortable with a 4 or 5 month, whatever. We got to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, when we reach that, then we're gonna call it what it is, and we're gonna start taking these steps so that we don't keep pushing the envelope and getting ourselves to a place that we don't want to be and we've already damaged our pastures again. So drought management strategies that we can use are basically anything that reduces forage demand or provides additional forage. So, whatever is going to be appropriate and agreeable to your client. It's going to depend on what options he has available to him. There's always, we do have the option of reducing the herd. It's not easily done, but it is a possibility. Something that most ranchers can do is they can wean early. That reduces the forage demand. We get the calves out of there. It reduces the mama's nutritional need. If a client can get a hold of supplemental pasture, or if he can stockpile some feed in the pasture. Not many do that, but some have been open to it. There's the option of providing supplemental feed. I know here on the Big Island that when times get really hard, people are baling guinea grass from other parts of the island and bringing it and supplementing, and that's something that can be considered. Some ranches accelerate their culling. They'll get their cull cows out of there and get them sold as pregnant, last calf cows or whatever. Whatever the client is agreeable to should be what you describe. If some of these things are not options for them, then don't put them in there. But your contingency plan should describe it well enough such that the client knows what his options are, and then that he also knows that he's got to document, if we get into a drought and he starts taking some management actions, he's got to document what he did. A drought management strategy is not to open all the gates and just let the cattle fend for themselves. Okay, that's not a drought management strategy. That's not something we want to encourage. But if we do get into a drought and they've taken the steps and they've implemented their contingency plan and their stubble heights are a little less than what they should be, that's something we can work with. For all intents and purposes, he's followed the 528 plan that we agreed to, and we shouldn't have any problem certifying prescribed grazing, and we would have all this documentation in order to justify it, and I would be happy to stand behind anyone that was ever in that situation. Okay? So the last part of the plan is the monitoring plan. In the monitoring plan, we got to identify the appropriate monitoring methods, identify and describe the key forage, the key grazing area, and the targeted times that we're going to do the monitoring. And from the spec, the language is in there that says that, planners, make sure you receive training on using these monitoring methods before attempting to apply them. I know we've got some new folks out there that maybe never got trained in how to appropriately gather stubble height information, how to conduct frequency monitoring and stuff. So for those of you that might need that training, just send me an email. We'll schedule something. If you got 528 that needs to be certified this year, then we can make it a double whammy. You can get it done, and we can get some training for you. Okay? So when it comes time for certification, we would work with the client, collect their grazing records, conduct that monitoring with them, compare the grazing records, the monitoring data, the field conditions, really start to evaluate it. Are the conditions improving? Talk to the client. What is he seeing or she seeing? Is the client able to follow the plan? Is there adjustments that they've had to make? Is there things that we want to talk about? And are stubble heights being achieved? If they're not, why? Do we need to adjust something? In management practices, we've got to maintain some degree of flexibility, and in the first year of implementation, it's usually a really good idea to try to touch bases with them before you're at the year end. Touch bases with them after the first quarter or the first half of the year, and just see how things are going. See if they have any questions, if they put those fence lines in, are they having any problems, so that we can help them ensure that they can succeed in implementing it in their first year and earning that payment. If we're in a drought, be sure we gather any information or evidence that the client has that they implemented their contingency plan, and then we document all of that on the prescribed grazing certification worksheet. Okay? So, I hope you're beginning to see that, a good understanding of that 528 practice is really critical to conservation planning on grazing land. It really affects everything else. All the planning that we do has to be working towards an achievable 528 program. Once the system is selected, all the other details can be worked out. Exactly where the fences are going to go, how many feet of fence we're going to be putting in, what type of fence it's going to be, where the pipeline and watering facilities are going to be. Again, you probably want to do a little bit of checking. If you might have limitations based on pressure or elevation, you want to be working with your engineer to identify those before designing a system. You don't want to design a system where you've got paddocks that you cannot get water to without, real expensive pumps and whatnot. There's usually an option that you can do with gravity, usually. Sometimes you have to use a pump, but you can work out the details for critical area planting, like for this example, and then the prescribed grazing plan. Always, when we're scheduling these practices, we've got to be considering the livestock logistics and practice implementation needs for timing, right? So if we're doing plant establishment practices, how much time does that take? Does it need to be well established before, like, we're going to put the livestock on it again? Or if we're going to be doing soil disturbing practices, we may have to control the animal's presence. We might need to be factoring in time for engineering, depending on what it does, what it requires. Generally, when we're doing a conservation plan, like the example that I just used, we would want to make sure that we're putting water out there first, because if we build a bunch of fences but we don't have any water, we've effectively excluded area for grazing that we can't graze because there's no water out there. So we usually do water first, followed by fencing. In this example, then we would go in with a critical area planting, because now we can control and keep the livestock out while we're treating certain areas. Prescribed grazing then can be scheduled once there's adequate infrastructure in place that allows for some level of grazing management that will meet or exceed the practice requirements. So as long as they can meet the stubble height and recovery periods. The one exception is going to be if a site would benefit from a complete deferment, then that can happen earlier. If that is agreeable to the client and he has that flexibility. There is that option. Deferred grazing is an option under 528, and so that is something that can be done. Talk to me if you're ever in that situation and you want to consider that. Okay, let's take this whole understanding of analysis and apply it to this beautiful situation that we saw last week. For those of you that were able to come out, this was Site 3, our Purple Ageratum site. Surely it's unforgettable. Out there we had 0 measurable forage. We saw a plant community that resulted from years of constant overgrazing and mowing. The whole plant community was either poisonous or unpalatable to livestock. We had major plant resource concerns. Unmute your phones and somebody tell me what should be here. Somebody from Kahului. Is Kahului still on the phone?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay.
Guinea grass?
Guinea grass, yes. Guinea grass should be there. We saw that right outside the fence, right, Jason? If we spray all this or disc it and plant it, did we solve the problem? Somebody from Hilo. If we spray all this or disc it and plant it, did we solve the problem?
No, it needs proper management.
Right, because what caused the problem in the first place?
Overgrazing, especially the horses.
constant grazing pressure. The mowing probably didn't help. If we don't address the things that cause the problem, we've not solved the problem, right? We've just given a headache some Tylenols and we've gotten it through the night, but we didn't get to the tumor that's causing the headaches. So we got to make sure that we are adequately identifying what the problem is and the causes of the problems to make sure that the solutions that we might attempt to apply are actually going to make it better. So if we dig a little deeper and we get a little more information, I'm sorry I didn't have this last week, but we had to make that last minute change. The operation, we were in this 13.7 acre paddock in the field that day. We saw this 4.9 acre, we saw that there was a gate open into that, and we also saw there was a gate open into this upper 20.5 acre pasture. So based on inventory someone else did and looking at the aerial imagery, this is what I was able to determine we actually had to work with out there. All of it is soil type 959, and that soil type estimates that we should have a production from 8 to 16,000 pounds per acre. definitely this isohyperthermic tall grassland is a guinea grass plant community. The client mainly keeps horses in these pastures. The number varies because he's got a trail riding operation. I could actually count the horses that are out there from one of the aerial images, and he's had up to 20. And while we were out there last week, I think I saw 5 sheep and 3 goats. So we're going to assume that that's his situation. Last week we just had 5 horses, I believe. Let's assume that the client is open to the possibility of cross-fencing. We also recognize that water is apparently really limited. From what I could tell, the animals water directly in the pond. Didn't see any evidence of any kind of troughs. But I know that the client, he's told me that he's got a tractor and he's got equipment for disking, and he really prefers not to use herbicides. He tries to manage everything mechanically, and we'd have a long list of weeds, but some of the main worst ones was this purple ageratum, guava, and joey. So we know from our inventory we had very low pasture condition score. Our grazing land trend worksheet maybe looks something like this. Virtually all of the livestock's needs were being met by supplemental feed, but the client, says, well, I would like to have those pastures produce forage again. So we can run a benchmark forage animal balance. Is real easy. We got 0 production, so we just have this hugely declining system. And over the course of a year, if he's really providing all of their needs, he's providing over 80,000 pounds of supplemental feed a year. That's got to hurt his pocket. So we can start to, kind of explore what are some different options that we could do. He's always got options, and just like the first one, he could address just the water distribution so he could use the pastures he has out there. It would provide water out there, but the system, the plant community is so far gone, it would really do nothing for the plant problems. And even if he improved the grazing management and did more fencing and said that we're going to apply prescribed grazing, well, that's a good thing to strive for, but again, there's nothing for them to eat. And if we just started cutting those pastures up and letting them rest, it could be a very long time before desirable forages actually find their way back in there, and the guava would probably take off, and we'd have a guava forest with a bunch of undesirable weeds underneath and maybe more bare ground because now there's more shade. But another alternative might be to, yeah, we got to fix the water problem. Yes, we need to improve the grazing. And what kind of practices could we use in our toolbox to restore that forage plant community? We've got guava out there, we could do brush management, and surely we could do forage biomass planting. That option would effectively restore that plant community back to a productive grazing plant community, solve most of those resource concerns, if not all of them. Definitely in the long term, they'd all get solved. In the short term, he might still struggle with a little bit of herbaceous weeds, and his livestock water problem would be resolved. So let's say he goes for alternative 3. He says he wants to do these things. Some of the practices that we may try to schedule might be this list. But how we schedule those and how we cut it up and what areas we would treat when and in what order are other things that as planners we've really got to be able to walk through that thought process with the client so that we can put together a decent plan with a real schedule that's likely doable and able to be implemented. And especially if we're going to attach a contract to it, we're not stuck with doing all kinds of crazy modifications to reschedule stuff all the time or split stuff up. So one way it could work is, we could do something like this where they're already feeding all the animals. Let's say we could confine them to those bottom 2 fields and keep feeding them and figure out a way to get some temporary water out there. Maybe we could run a hose from the headquarters that was off to the right. We could work with him to use mechanical brush management with the equipment that he has in that top field, remove the guava, do a few diskings in order to kill those roots and deplete that herbaceous weed seed bank and prepare that soil for forage and biomass planting. We could plant an improved species. Signal grass would be well suited to that environment, or green panic if he can get the seed. We can then install a pipe, right? It's all in an order that would be doable. We'd have some place to keep the animals, could do all the work that we need to do as far as the earth disturbing work, and then start installing the infrastructure so that it could recover and then he could grow it and graze it. So install a pipe from either the ditch or the pond to some trough sites and cut that top field maybe up into 3 6.5 acre paddocks. That would be decent. Once those forages get well established, we could start grazing them in a rotation on those 3 pastures, as long as we have an appropriate herd size, and if we and recognize if we need to be able to still confine them and feed them for a portion of the time, in order that those paddocks could recover and we don't undo the work that we just did to plant it. Always having to make sure that the pastures aren't overutilized and they get a decent recovery period for the growing conditions that they're experiencing. Then we could jump down below and do brush management down there and forage biomass plantings, possibly on those bottom 2 fields maybe, and install, after we do the planting and stuff, do like we did up above, add on some more pipe and troughs, some cross fencing, and now we've got a decent 6 paddock rotation on a landscape that's been restored to productive grazing land. So once you have this planned sequence in mind and the quantities that can work for the client, now you can start to figure out how you break it up and discussing those specific time frames as far as months and years with the client based on his availability and what else he has going on in his life, and the amount of time and timing that we know that we'll need for vegetative establishment and we can take that information and start drafting it in toolkit as a schedule. Other considerations that we'd want to include in the discussions with the client would be time needed for engineering, like Drew brought up the other day. Time needed for making sure we get the seed or to arrive in time before the client needs to plant. We need to make sure that the client's aware of these kind of things so that he can plan accordingly. Not all ranchers are in the business of farming, right? They're not in the business of disking up their land and planting it to something. So these are all things that's good to have in the discussion. And before we finalize things, if we are going to do plant establishment, it's a really good idea that the client start checking around for, just how available seed is for whatever he's going to be considering, and make sure that he can secure whatever it is that he wants to plant. Okay, we're almost done. If we're going to do something like that scenario, well, what would an appropriate herd size look like when that top field is done? We can again use our grazing planning tool, and we can start popping some numbers in there, and we can start estimating what that might look like. So if we assume 10,000 pounds per acre for signal guinea grass mixture, the Grazing Land Stewardship Manual certainly agreed with that estimate. The soils did too. We could estimate that kind of production on those acres, and we could look at comparing that with his benchmark herd of what he had, those five horses, 5 sheep, 3 goats. The system's not quite balanced, but it's really close. So he'd probably need to plan on some supplemental feeding, or if he can part with any of those animals, maybe he doesn't need those sheep and those goats, then that might change things as well. This would be good information to have in a discussion with him as we start to figure out how we can make this thing work. And then when it's all said and done, what's it going to look like? We can then populate the other parts of that and speculate on what the acres would look like in each of those paddocks. When we plug in the forage production and the new grazing efficiency, what does that look like? Now the model estimates that we have a huge surplus of feed if we only have those 5 horses, 5 sheep, and 3 goats, right? So now we know, okay, well, we've got room now for more animals, but what could we get up to? The client sometimes brings 20 animals out there. Is that reasonable that he should be able to assume that he can keep 20 horses on these, this few of acres? We can play around with those numbers again, and we can work with them until we find a balance. And in this example, playing with the numbers resulted in we could balance it with 10 horses, the 5 sheep, and 3 goats. The 5 sheep and 3 goats are really not that much grazing pressure. Even if he got rid of those, he might be able to keep 1 more horse, but he should know that he can't realistically expect to keep 20 horses out there on this level of grazing management year-round. He will have to plan on continuing to supplemental feed. But information like this is very helpful to a client so they can prepare and have reasonable expectations of future conditions, and this can really help him make decisions. And it's always a good idea to estimate conservatively, because if you end up that you lowballed it a little bit and they come out a little bit better, then that's even better for the client. It's usually not so fun to be in the opposite situation where you overestimated it and it did not come out anywhere near what you thought. So, in summary, 528 grazing plans, they have to address both the needs of the plant community and the livestock. We've got to remember that we've got to take care of both, and we've got to have a balance. It is not based on stocking rate. One thing I'd always tell my clients is I'm not going to come out here and count your cows and tell you whether or not you meet prescribed grazing. That's not what we focus on. The forage animal balance is a tool, and it helps clients to manage their grazing. What we are more concerned with is what the land is telling us, what the grass is telling us about the grazing management. And the livestock production, of course. I mean, if he's having problems with that, then we have to figure out where the weak link is and how do we address it and how do we adjust. But it's about the whole system, yeah? Horse operations or others that have these changing, fluctuating stock numbers can be really challenging. Get help if you're working on one of those, if you need some help. And the main thing to understand for folks like that last situation is if they're going to rely on supplemental feeding, then they have to understand that that cannot occur on pastures where the utilization rate has already been achieved. If they think that they can keep the animals on a pasture and just provide supplemental feed, they got to recognize that those animals are they're going to keep grazing. When that new growth tries to come up, they're going to be very happy to take a bite of that yummy, sweet, fresh, succulent grass. They don't care. They're not trying to plan to make sure that grass is going to persist and it's going to stay productive. They're going to keep eating it. And so we have to make sure that the client understands if that's something that they're going to incorporate as part of their operation, that supplemental feeding has to occur in a dry lot or another sacrificed area that's not planned under 528. The plan should always emphasize the principles of grazing management. We should be able to talk comfortably with the client about frequency and duration, intensity and utilization rate, and recovery periods in order to help the client understand that ecology and manage it in a way that will stay healthy. You don't have to use those words. You know, if those words are too crazy and hard to understand, then break it down into simpler terms, but they've got to understand how their grazing management affects that plant community and make sure that they understand it in such a way that they can see the connections with how many animals and how they're being grazed and how it's affecting the plant community and what they can change in order to send that plant community in the direction that they want. And lastly, we should only contract 528 on acres if and when it's achievable. If it's not achievable, we shouldn't be putting it under contract because we're going to put both us and the client in a really difficult situation. Okay? So with that, I am done. Unless anybody has any questions or would like to go back and go over anything that we covered. Don't be shy. Is anybody still there? Yep. Okay, good.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Carolyn. I know that on this right now, I probably have a lot of ideas swirling in my head. So I know I'll be contacting you on a more personal one-on-one basis about stuff. So
great. No problem.
Let's take in. So thank you.
It's a lot, and I apologize. I really tried not to hose you guys with a fire hose, but try to give you guys lots of good information, and I put a lot of words on these slides so you'd have them to reference, and this recording, of course, will always be available if you want to maybe go through something a little bit again and maybe slower. As you're working on your planning and you're doing your inventory and stuff, if some of this stuff is really hanging you up, give me a call. Now that I've done this last webinar, I've pretty much told Tony I'm going to make field office support my top priority for the next several months. Please don't wait to the last minute, because if I have all the offices calling me at the last minute, I'm not going to be able to get to everybody. So if you have some stuff that are already half-baked, let's go over them. Let's talk about them. If you've got stuff from last year that didn't get funded, you want to bounce it off of me and see, hey, is this what you're looking for? Is this going to be adequate? Can I move forward on this one? Let's get those out of the way already. I'm going to be around for most of the holidays. I'm just taking a little bit of time off, but I'm here and I'm available. Jessica, I'll see you tomorrow. Bring whatever you got, and we'll start on that one. But I really hope this was helpful. I tried to give you guys real life examples and situations that we kind of deal with. I know there's so much variety out there. There's no way I could ever capture all of it, but the concepts are what's important, and the concepts are going to be the things that you're seeing in your work environment. So I hope these webinars have helped, and again, I look forward to coming alongside any and all of you and helping you with whatever you need this year. And we'll get through this together, That's what it's all about. We are a team after all. Okay? So if nobody else has any questions, then we're done. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you, Carolyn. This has been